So, we hear a lot about defenses of the resurrection. Of course, Gary Habermas is probably the world's leading expert on that right now.
Yep.
Of course, our friend Mike Licona and others. But I think you have a little different perspective being a cold case homicide detective. So how does that aid you in looking at this issue of the resurrection?
Well, I think you're right in the sense that there's a number of ways to look at this, right? And a lot of us bring our own expertise to the game based on how we were trained or what we are skilled in. If I was an historian, I would be I'd be talking about it from the perspective of a historian. But I was none of those things when I was an atheist at the age of 35 and started to look at this. And I do think there's an aspect of this that is so similar to what you do when you're working cold cases. Because we are working events that are locked in history. These are murders, but they are locked in history. And they're locked in history just outside of my availability. So I typically have reports that are written about eyewitness accounts. I don't have access to those eyewitnesses. They've been dead for 10 years. Now, to be honest, once your witness is dead, I don't care if he's dead for 10 years or 10,000 years, he's not available to you either way. So the idea that this is a recent event in the past is still the same kind of event. Also, I don't even have access often to the report writers. The supplemental report writers are usually detectives back in the 70s. And they wrote a report based on what they learned from an eyewitness. But now the witness is gone, and so is the report writer. What does that sound like? That is exactly what we have in the Gospels. And it turns out that the process that we use to figure out, well, what really did happen, even though I have no access to witnesses or report writers, that's the same process I use to figure out what really did happen. And I will tell you that sometimes when we study the resurrection, it's easy to get caught up in academia on this. Here's what I mean.
Sure.
I see sometimes people will come up with theories trying to explain, for example, the differences they see in the accounts. Because Mark says one thing, and it seems like Luke's saying something kind of different, even though he seems to be using Mark as a source. And then you got Matthew's account, which is also slightly different. And if you just took the Passion account of Easter and compared all four Gospels, there are atheists out there that are challenging young Christians to do this because they feel that the differences are so dramatic that you'll shatter the faith of anyone who's ever considered the Passion Week.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out if you spend some time talking to witnesses who have recorded the same event, and by the way, historians don't typically get to do that. And literary critics don't get to do that. And textual critics don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. Detectives get to do that. So the thing that got me interested from the very beginning was that there were these differences in the accounts, which I would expect if they are reliable eyewitness accounts. What I have a tendency to kind of shrink from is when we develop an academic theory to explain away the differences between the accounts, when in reality it's the differences between the accounts which draws them toward reliability. In other words, if you've interviewed enough witnesses, you will not, I'm not going to say, well, maybe there's a theory related to genre in 1975 that would allow these two witnesses to say something slightly different. No, there's no theory related. This is what eyewitnesses do. And so a lot of what I try to do in a class like we have at Southern Evangelical Seminary is just talk about the nature of eyewitness testimony and the rules that we use in criminal trials to evaluate eyewitnesses in spite of the differences they may have in their accounts, and how if you applied that same technique to the differences you'll see in the Gospels, you won't need to run to an additional theory. You'll just see that this is exactly what we would expect them to look like. And this does not mean that these differences are necessarily contradictory. Remember, the one thing I ask people when I get dispatched to a homicide, because it's the middle of the night and I'm not wearing a suit. I got to get dressed. I got to get there. It's going to take me probably an hour and 15 minutes before I can be on scene. So I tell the dispatcher, have the officers on the scene do one thing for me, only one thing: separate the eyewitnesses. And the reason why I ask them to separate the eyewitnesses is if you don't separate them, you'll get one story 5 times.
Right.
What I'm looking for are the 5, even they might look contradictory at times, but the 5 slightly differing stories that I then, as the investigator, get to puzzle together to get the most robust sense of what really happened. And that's what I did with the Gospels, using that same approach How do we puzzle these accounts together without saying I've got to call that not true, and I've got to say, well, that's an exaggeration, or that's okay. Maybe in the first century, it was okay to exaggerate. There's no need to go to these kinds of theories, because this is exactly what eyewitnesses do every day. Mm-hmm. And once you know that, it gives you a little better sense of confidence, number one. And number two, it kind of points you in a direction as to how to engage those differences, how to reconcile those differences. Because it turns out, if I went there and said, well, look, there's some differences here, so I can never return to any truth about the crime scene. Well, give me a break.
Sure.
By the way, defense attorneys love these differences because they're going to call them out. And I've got to teach a jury why the differences don't disqualify the witnesses. Mm. Well, the same thing is true when I'm sharing the Gospels with people. I have to teach them enough about eyewitness testimony that they will not disqualify the Gospels because there are differences in the Gospels.
Well, I think you make two important points there, that the differences don't necessarily entail contradictions, but also the skeptic who simply wants to find a reason not to believe, they're gonna harp on the differences as if that disqualifies them. But like you said, if they were all the same, then they would be harping on the fact that they're all the same, and they're going to conclude collusion or something in that respect.
Right.